Acquiring a defenseman remains top of mind for Leafs GM Brad Living. Who could he potentially target, and what kind of trades are being thrown out there? I'll discuss that and more on this edition of the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You're Locked On Maple Leafs, your daily podcast on the Toronto Maple Leafs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Leafs podcast, your daily fix for all things Leafs. I'm your host, David Morassutti from Sportsnet. As always, Locked On Leafs is a daily Maple Leaf-centric podcast, so be sure to subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts from, and make sure you catch us up on YouTube, Locked On Leafs, each and every day, because it is your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your best bet of $5 or more wins. Visit fanduel.com/lockedon to get started. As you can see, I'm solo for today. Mike DeStefano is not here this week. He is on vacation, and the Leafs are also technically on a vacation because they are in the All-Star break. They are not scheduled to play again until February 5th when they welcome the New York Islanders, and there are some players who won't get the week off, namely Austin Matthews, Morgan Riley, Mitch Marner, William Nylander, with the NHL All-Star game coming to Toronto. So most of the Leafs are probably somewhere nice and warm, probably getting some much needed relaxation and rest as they go for the final stretch of the season here. But you know who's probably still working? The Leafs front office, especially general manager Brad Treliving. And it's no surprise to hear Ellie Friedman on the 32 Thoughts podcast. If you haven't listened to it yet, I do suggest you go and listen to it. It's always a great podcast to get some great insider info. And basically, Ellie Friedman's echoing what he has probably been saying for a really long time, and that is that the Leafs are in on almost every defenseman that you could potentially name as a potential trade target. The Leafs are most likely checking in on that defenseman to not only see their availability, but what the cost would be to acquire said defenseman. It is the one position the Leafs have needed to figure out basically since the offseason. Yeah, even after the John Klingberg signing, who would have thought the Leafs still needed to improve their defense? Well, after watching John Klingberg play defense, that became pretty apparent. So the Leafs are still looking to add a defenseman. We don't really know if there's a specific target out there because it's tough to gauge really where certain teams are in terms of buyers and sellers, right? You know, I know for the longest time we talked about a player like Chris Tanev. And at one point, the Calgary Flames decided, let's go on a little bit of a run here, actually play some decent hockey and put ourselves in the playoff conversation. Well, unfortunately, the Calgary Flames currently find themselves 5 points out of the playoffs, and they have, as I'm looking here on the right now, three teams ahead of them, with LA and St. Louis holding the final two spots. So they would have to leapfrog three teams to even get into a wild card position, with Nashville, Seattle, and Arizona all ahead of them in the standings. But here remains why, obviously, we're not really hearing specific targets as well for the Leafs, and it really becomes twofold here. How much is Brad Treliving willing to spend at the trade deadline? That I've heard some people say that Brad Treliving shouldn't even go out and make a trade ahead of the trade deadline, considering how this team has played this year. They're not one defenseman away. If you ask a lot of people, this team is not one defenseman away from turning their season around and being a legitimate Stanley Cup contender. Are they a playoff team? Yeah, they are a playoff team. People can argue against that, but can't argue the fact that right now in the standings, they are a playoff team. It's just they haven't played like a Stanley Cup contender. Nobody is arguing that, I don't think. There are probably people who say that this team can get things back together. Like the Toronto Maple Leafs are 5th in the Eastern Conference in points percentage. So yes, while they are out of a wild card spot right now, you also need to remember that the teams ahead, like Tampa, have 3 games, at least have 3 games in hand on Tampa. So that gap there, and Tampa's only 1 point up. That gap there can be shrunk pretty easily, even just with one win by the Leafs. All right. So you have to think about that. Where how the Leafs have played this year. General Manager Brad Treliving really needs to decide what's the best use of the assets. And we all remember when Brad Treliving came here in the offseason, he pretty much said, I don't build my teams through trading during the season. That's just not the way that Brad Treliving kind of sees it, right? And so that's going to be a tough task for him to really decide, should he even spend the assets at all for this Leafs team. And look, when you are pretty much in win now mode, when as the Leafs have been ever since they acquired John Tavares, the clock kind of started for them to push and go for a Stanley Cup. Okay. When you have your top players like Marner, Matthews, Nylander, Riley, they're not, rookies anymore. They're getting in their primes. They're in the primes of their career. How many times can you say, you know what? We got to go for it. We got to go for it. It's cost this Leafs team, really, if you think about it. All those years that they have traded first round picks, second round picks, even third round picks, not having those assets to draft has put them in tough spots. Now, all is forgiven, right? When you go out and you win a cup. But unfortunately, when you don't go as far as you want with all those first round exits, that steep price of a first round pick eventually does catch up to you, right? And we know where this Leafs team is right now with their caps, with their draft pick scenario, where if they decide to trade this year's first round pick, the 2024 pick, then the Leafs would then not have a pick for 2 years until 2026. So if they trade this year's first, they won't pick in the first round again until 2026. The Leafs do not have a second round pick for the next 3 drafts. That's something to also keep in mind there. Second round picks are still valuable picks. The Leafs do have all their third round picks. They technically own the Islanders' third round pick for this year. They recouped that in the Pierre Engvall trade. The Leafs have 3 fifth rounders. Maybe they could do something with all those fifth rounders that they want to go and grab a depth option. That's something they could consider. But when we're talking about making that significant trade, that 2024 first round pick, or maybe the 2026 first round pick, whichever one the team decides is, the one they want to put in play, you have to really think about, is it worth giving up that pick for potentially, I don't even know what you can really get just for the pick. You probably have to add more depending on what this Leafs team wants to do. And Brad Treliving, to me, it doesn't scream like he wants to go out and get a rental. And personally, and if you listen to the last edition of the podcast when I had James from Offside Talk, Hockey Talk on, I wasn't too into the idea of trading a first round pick to get a rental. The Leafs have done this way too often, and it's come back to bite them. They don't get enough out of that first round pick for your rental. They just don't. You're taking a huge gamble. I mentioned it yesterday. I'm going to mention it again today. Reason why Tampa has been able to keep that window open for as long as they've done it is because when they trade a first round pick, they're getting more than a rental. They find a way to keep, Brandon Hagel, that was, an RFA. Different scenario, was a guy that they had under contract. He was under contract, then they signed him to that extension. I look at the guys that they have brought in with those first round picks, and they're still there. When they spend the capital, they keep the player around. But what Tampa also does, when they realize they are keeping a certain player and they need to make room they find a way to trade the other players for something. You think about Ross Colton being traded to the Colorado Avalanche, right? Yeah, in some cases, Tampa has had to make the tough choice and let guys walk. It's the way it goes. You can't keep everybody. And this is something I think the Leafs really need to consider. If they are even going to trade for a defenseman, I remain of the opinion that you are getting someone, you need to be getting someone that is not a rental. You need to have someone here after this season, because when you look at this defense after the season, Brody's a UFA, Giordano's a UFA. You do not have, and you have Liljegren, who is an RFA. You don't have many options past this season on your blue line. Okay. You have Riley, Jake McCabe, Connor Timmins under contract. Yeah, you have Simon Benoit as an RFA, and you have Timothy Liljegren as an RFA. So you don't have a lot set for going forward. You now have to figure out how you're going to build this team with the new contract extension for William Nylander and Austin Matthews. Both of those guys getting pay raises. Nylander almost pretty much doubling his, well, not really doubling, 1.7 times what his current cap hit is right now. Matthews gave him that extra couple million, almost couple million right there. Those are things you have to take into account when you're making these deals. And I guess, yeah, they now know what their cap structure is going forward. But I will give Kyle Dubas this. In last year's trade deadline, he traded a lot. And there were some rentals in there. But that trade, when he got Jake McCabe and Sam Lafferty from Chicago, that was the deal I liked the most. I mean, I also liked the Luke Schenn deal. I thought Luke Schenn was a pretty decent ad for what he brought and the price they paid as a third-round pick. But Jake McCabe and Sam Lafferty, I'm okay with trading a first-round pick because those guys weren't rentals. Unfortunately, Sam Lafferty was traded. You probably want to do that trade again. Even you would find a different way to make the cap work, in my opinion. But that's a trade there. That's the type of deal this Leafs team needs to look at. And I don't know how many of those deals are out there. But we can take a look. We can take a look to see if that deal is potentially out there. So we'll come back. We'll look at that here on the other side. This is the Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Happy Super Bowl Sunday to all who celebrate from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. If you're like me, Super Bowl Sunday is all about scoring the best seat on the couch, grabbing your favorite football snacks, and placing some super bets. FanDuel has so many ways for you to end with a W, or 2 or 3 this season. Not only can you bet who will win Super Bowl 58, but FanDuel also has bets for which player will score a touchdown, how many points will be scored, and so much more. Newcomers, join today and you'll get $200 in bonus bets if your first bet of $5 or more wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports book partner of the NFL and the Locked On Podcast Network. Today's episode is also brought to you by Factor. Get started on your resolutions with Factor so you're ready for the new year. Factor's ready to eat meal delivery takes the stress out of meal planning and sets you up for success in the new year. Skip the grocery stores, prep work, and cooking fatigue. Instead, get chef-crafted, dietitian-approved meals delivered right to your door with over 35 meals to choose from per week, including options like keto, calorie smart, vegan, veggie, and more. Plus, over 55 weekly add-ons. You'll have a ton of nutritious and flavorful options to kickstart your resolutions. Forget frantic lunch preps and rush dinners. Factor's 2-minute meals are your secret weapon in the new year. Fuel up fast with restaurant quality meals, all delivered right to your door. Skip the overpriced takeout trap. Factor's cheap and way more delicious than takeout. Get chef crafted, restaurant quality meals delivered right to your door. They're ready to heat and eat in just 2 minutes, which means more time for you. Head to factormeals.com/lockedonnhl50 and use code LockedOnNHL50 to get 50% off. That's code LockedOnNHL50 at factormeals.com/LockedOnNHL50 to get 50% off. Welcome back to the Locked On Leafs podcast. David Morassutti here. Mike DeStefano is not here for this week. He is enjoying I believe he's in the Caribbean on a very nice and well-deserved vacation. And a lot of players are probably in Mike's boat right now, getting into some nice sunny weather as the NHL All-Star break is here. There are still some hockey being played right now. Those teams will eventually get their break when their schedule is done as well for the NHL All-Star break. So kind of weird how they do it. I thought almost everyone would be off at the same time, but it also makes sense to not have all your teams off at the same time and leave your schedule completely empty. It's a good opportunity for the NHL to get some games in while it's a little bit quieter in the sports world right now. But what won't be quiet is trade chatter. That will still remain heading into the NHL trade deadline. And the Leafs have some big decisions to make, as I said in the last segment. And it's tough to know exactly where the Leafs will go because we don't really know exactly which players will be traded going into the NHL trade deadline. Now, for those who don't know, the NHL trade deadline is on Friday, March the 8th at 3 o'clock Eastern, like it always is, 3 o'clock Eastern. Those trades have to come in. So the Leafs and every team that's looking to make a deal right now, you're going to start hearing some trade chatter, I think, over the next few weeks as we close the chat. We're pretty much closing the book on January. We're entering February really soon. That final month is going to be crucial for any team looking to make a deal. And as we have seen in the last few years, the real deals have come not on NHL trade deadline day. There are still some deals. But a lot of the deals happen before then. You think about the Ryan O'Reilly trade last year, that happened well before the NHL trade deadline. And it allowed Kyle Dubas and company to see how much this team really needed. They made that trade. It gave them a little bit more time to kind of assess what exactly the team was looking to do, what the team needed to do. And so now the real question here is who could the Leafs potentially go after heading into the NHL trade deadline? And unfortunately, if you're looking at pure rentals, there are some. Now, the only one name out of the rental market, maybe two, really scream to me as Leafs targets. And the main reason is the team that they play for right now. You look at the Calgary Flames, they're a team that's not in the playoff picture right now. They're a team that I think isn't going to allow what's going on this season to dictate what's going to happen in the offseason. Flames GM Craig Conroy, in a way, doesn't want to look at this group and say, we're going to give this group a chance to go out and compete and then potentially lose Chris Tanev, Noah Hannafin, and Elias Lindholm. Let them walk out the door for nothing. I don't see Craig Conroy doing that. And if you ask a lot of people in Calgary, they don't see that happening. So if you're Brad Living, you look at Hannafin and Tanev, and we know Ellie Freeman, I think, reported this a while ago, that the Leafs would have considered doing multiple defensemen from Calgary. This is when Zadorov was still available. And the Leafs were trying to see if maybe there's a way to get both Tanev and Zadorov. And it was clear that was just not enticing enough for Calgary to do. And the salary matching would have been really tough for the Leafs to get done. So when you look at Chris Tanev, I'll start with him first because he's a player. Again, we talked about this guy so many times on the podcast. He would be the ideal target for the Leafs. Top 4 player. Really could see him being, if you hear Sheldon Keefe talk about he really doesn't have guys he can trust in those final moments, Chris Tanev would be that guy. If for me, I would say if you're bringing in Tanev, you could easily slide TJ Brody lower in the lineup. Maybe you have a pairing of TJ Brody and Jake McCabe. And then you can put Simon Benoit on that third pairing where he really should be playing and could probably be a really good asset as a third pairing defenseman. He's done very well for what he's being asked to, but he shouldn't be asked to be a top 4 defenseman for this long. And I think the Leafs understand that. So if there's a defenseman out there that we know should probably be available, it is Chris Tanev. Obviously, now, here are the concerns with Chris Tanev. He's a rental. No guarantee he signs, will even consider signing an extension in Toronto. So that's something you have to, balance the risk and the reward. And maybe, Brad Treliving knows what Chris Tanev is looking for in a potential contract. There's that familiarity there. Chris Tanev is 34. So if you even do look to sign Chris Tanev, how long are you going to give him in a deal? Because, the same people who are complaining about TJ Brody and how he's slowing down, they're probably going to have the same criticisms if the Leafs sign Chris Tanev to an extension. And really, the Leafs are in a position right now where, they don't have many defensemen coming through the wings right now that you could say can come in and replace a Chris Tanev. But we've seen also what could happen if you sign a deal with a defenseman that is on the decline. Now, I'm not saying Chris Tanev is on the decline. I think he would be the top defensive option on this team if they were to trade for him. No doubt about that. You just have to be very careful about his age and his injury history. He has not been healthy. Now, not all of it his fault. The style of play, he gets himself in those situations where, he takes a shot off the hand. He blocks a shot in an awkward way. He blocks a shot off his head. I've seen that from Chris Tanev. So you have to be very, very careful about that. But I do think Chris Tanev would be the ideal target if you can get him signed to a deal. It doesn't even have to be a really long deal, but something to say that at least if we're trading that first round pick, because I've heard, especially if you need salary retained, that's the only way I would trade a first round pick. If salary is being retained, I get Chris Tanev. I have an inkling that I can get Chris Tanev signed. Now, I've also remember one point hearing about, would Noah Hannafin be a guy too? That's an interesting move. I just don't know if if Noah Hannafin, if that would work. I just don't know if the Leafs have enough there to get a Noah Hannafin deal done. And honestly, I don't even think the Leafs would be able to sign him. I think Noah Hannafin wants to go out and get a really good deal and wants his choice of a spot. We've heard inklings that maybe he would go back to Calgary. There's been talks about a deal being in the works there, but we don't know exactly where Calgary stands on that. And I don't know if Noah Hannafin sees himself as a long-term fit with Toronto. So that's something you have to consider there too when you're looking at deals like that. I've seen, I think The Athletic, I think Jonas Siegel had put out, in his trade targets, a guy like David Savard, where, he's viewed as a depth guy. He signed past this year at $3.5 million, which isn't cheap, right? When you look at this Leaf salary cap structure, $3.5 million for a defenseman, it's expensive when you consider what he brings. He's purely defensive, purely a defensive defenseman. Is he a top 4 guy? I don't know. I don't think he's been playing hard minutes and things like that, but I don't know if that's the fit unless you get some salary retained. I don't think Montreal would make things easier for Toronto to acquire a David Savard. So that's the type of player you could use in the playoffs. I definitely understand that. He has a lot of experience. He's won a cup. He does those tough things, that you would need from a defenseman like Savard. But you have to be careful of obviously the price and the contract with David Savard as well. And he also has an injury history as well. That's the other thing you have to consider as well. So, and I'll even throw out some other names that I've seen people ask me about. Jacob Chikrin. I don't know how things would go in Ottawa if they decide to trade Jacob Chikrin, because I know that Steve Staios doesn't understand why Chikrin's name is in the room mill. Well, unfortunately, when the Senators have been in the position they've been in all season long, they're not going to be seen as buyers. Although we did hear that Tanev was a player that Ottawa was looking for. But the thing is, Chris Tanev has a modified no trade clause. He could put Ottawa on that no trade clause and null and void. That interest from Ottawa can go away very easily. I think for a Jacob Chicken to Toronto scenario, I just don't know if that's the defenseman they need. He brings the offense from the blue line, which obviously it would be nice to have. But we also know that he is not that defensive reliable player that, yeah, he brings the skill, but he doesn't bring those elements that the Leafs really need. The good thing is he has another year left on his deal, $4.6 million. So at least then you're not paying for a rental. But we know Ottawa, considering he has a year left on his deal, are going to want a king's ransom. And I don't know if they even want to trade a Jacob Chickering to Toronto too. That's something you always have to consider when you're looking at rival teams. We've heard Ilya Lyubushkin's name being brought up. Again, he's a player that had success in Toronto when he was here. Got a good contract out of it when he went to Buffalo. He has a $2.75 million cap hit. Anaheim can easily take half of that, considering they are not in a position to go out and be a contender, and they're going to want assets for an Ilya Lyubushkin. How much? This is similar to that Luke Shen territory, like that third round pick I could potentially see for an Ilya Lyubushkin. That's how I potentially see that. And you know what, Leafs fans know what Ilya Lyubushkin brings to the table. So there's that familiarity there as well. Other players that I've seen on top of Lyubushkin, I've seen Adam Larson's name being brought up. That to me seems like maybe too much for the Leafs to go after. He would be a good top 4 fit, don't get me wrong. But you have to think about a couple of things here. He has a modified no trade clause. He has a 10-team no trade list. He could easily put, the Leafs on that. He has another year left at $4 million, $4 million cap hit, which not terrible for a top 4 defenseman. We know that he's really good at blocking shots. He plays that style game that I think could be very useful for Toronto. He got some good playoff experience when he was with Seattle last year. He had some with the Oilers, not a whole lot. I wouldn't hate the idea of bringing in Adam Larson. I would just be very wary of the cost. Obviously, that first round pick would have to be included. But that Seattle's asking for more than a first round pick for Adam Larson. That's just what I think. How much? Tough to say. They would probably go after a prospect or two on top of that. And then I know I've seen Sean Walker's name. To me, he does not look like the Brad Treliving prototypical defenseman of small size, more of an offensive guy than a defensive guy. But he's having a great season, playing over 21 minutes for Philly, one of the bigger surprises of the year. Just don't know if that's exactly what the Leafs need. Again, we're all talking. The Leafs are not going to be able to go out and get a bunch of guys. They don't have enough bullets in the chamber, and their cupboards for the prospects are pretty bare. I don't see them wanting to trade an Easton Count. Definitely not a Fraser Minton with the way that he's played this year, and how close he is to the NHL, how much closer he was than maybe we thought he was initially. So you just have to be very careful about going too far with trade ideas. Speaking of trade ideas, why don't we look at some here on the other side? I did see some over at CapFriendly. I thought would be interesting to point out here. So we'll do that here on the other side. This is Locked On Leafs podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Leafs podcast is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. What brings home the winning trophy is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring it home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymars.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guarantee fit only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to the Locked On Leafs podcast. David Morassutti here, and we've looked at some potential trade targets that the Leafs could look at. And then I'm like, what would these cost? What would the Leafs even be willing to pay to get a defenseman, or even to get any any of the potential options out there? And I always like, as an example, as a little exercise, to go and see maybe one, there's some decent options being thrown out there on CapFriendly, because CapFriendly, as you know, they do have the Armchair GM, where you can make trades, you can make changes to the roster. We've done it here on the podcast before. Sometimes you get some interesting ones, and then you get your jaw drops to the floor sometimes when you see some of these ideas. So let's get right into it. So I'm going to share my screen here for those that are watching on YouTube. Those of you that are not watching on YouTube, you may want to go and take a look here. If you're listening on the audio form, just get a little later into the podcast here on YouTube. So this one was labeled as True Living's Dream. Okay. This one here, now, I'm not always going to bring up options like this because I think they're serious. I just want to see where's the mindset that some of these people go with. So basically, this is like the Leafs deciding we want all the Calgary guys from Calgary. And apparently, this person believes that the Brad Treliving's dream is to go and get Blake Coleman, Jonathan Huberdeau, Nazem Kadri, Mackenzie Weegar. Yes, all players that he acquired during his time in Calgary. I see what they're doing here. You get that Calgary has the pleasure of receiving Simon Benoit, Noah Gregor, Calle Yarncroke, Matthew Nyes, Timothy Liljegren, Nick Robertson. Yeah, we already know that trade is never happening. I don't know why people even bother even going through this. And then I didn't realize it at first. There was more. There was more to this than just this ludicrous trade to Calgary. Let's go and see what the Leafs would give up to get Dougie Hamilton from the New Jersey Devils. You're going to trade Mitch Marner, Fraser Minton, Morgan Rielly. Oh, take 2 first-round picks while you're at it. Okay, fine. We'll entertain that idea for some strange reason that the Leafs would trade all that for Dougie Hamilton. Okay. It gets better. There's a third trade, because then the Leafs are going to actually go back to Calgary, and they're going to trade them Jacob Markstrom. Okay, they're going to get Jacob Markstrom to trade them Pontus Holmberg, John Tavares, Joseph Woll, and 2 third-round picks. Sure, why not? Just continue to gut the roster and covers. Oh, it gets better. Oh, then you're also going to get Michael Backlund, sign him to a 7-year extension, trade him Easton Cowan, Jake McCabe, and Topi Niemela. So the best part about this is I wanted to see what this Leafs roster would look like. And for some reason, Jeff Carter is here too. So this is more of a long-term outlook past this season. And I don't get this. Do you think this Leafs roster is somehow better? And John, we got Chris Tanev at $1.25 million. I don't even know how that happened. One of the more bizarre things I have seen on CapFriendly, and I've seen some really, really bizarre things. Let's go on to another interesting deal that I saw here on CapFriendly. We got the ludicrous one out of the way. I just want to show you, some people have too much time on their hands sometimes when they go on CapFriendly. So this one here, people really like the idea of Colton Parayko. So in this deal, the Leafs would get Colton Parayko, Oscar Sundqvist, pretty decent depth player, for TJ Brody, Timothy Liljegren, Bobby McMahon, Fraser Minton, a first and a third. Why St. Louis would do this? Not entirely sure. They do get younger players like Minton and Liljegren. They get the draft capital. The Leafs get Colton Parayko, who, you know what? Colton Parayko right now, wouldn't mind. Colton Parayko down the road, with his cap hit, with his contract and his age and potential decline, not really sure I'm as much of a fan of that, considering what you're giving up. Yes, you get Colton Parayko for the long haul. Just not sure that's something I would want the Leafs to do. Then you make another trade with the Seattle Kraken. You get Adam Larson at half retained for this year, next year. Cole Lind, and Seattle would get Topi Niemela, Connor Timmins, a 5th round pick, and the 2026 first round pick. A deal like this, I will say, isn't the most bizarre deal I would expect. I kind of said that a deal for Adam Larson would have to include a first. You'd have to do something potential with the money. So Seattle would get a player back in Connor Timmins. Don't know if that really does much for Seattle. Topi Niemela is obviously with the first round pick. He's a center part of the deal. All depends on if Seattle even values Topi Niemela. He's done pretty well with the Marlies, but he's not many people are jumping out of their seats for Topi Niemela. He's not being really propped up as a top prospect like Fraser Minton and Easton Cowan are right now. And then there's a final deal here, kind of a couple of little minor deals. Troy Stecher for a 3rd round pick, Connor Dewar from Minnesota for a 3rd round pick. And then you would send Ryan Reeves to the AHL so you can get all the cap stuff to work. So really the big changes on the 4th line here, which again, yeah, I kind of, when you look at what the Leafs are going to do, don't know how much the top 6 is going to change between now and the trade deadline. The real change obviously comes on the right side of the defense. Here, you pretty much redid your whole right side with Larson, Parayko, and Stecher, according to this person. I just think that's a lot. We know how much when the Leafs made all those changes last year, it really kind of affected the balance and the chemistry. I just think that's a little too much to consider. But I still think the Adam Larson one, that's an interesting nugget there. If Adam Larson's available and if the Leafs even want to consider a deal like that. All right, we got one last one here that I will bring up. So again, this one was not as bad as the first one that I brought up, the ludicrous one. Now we have the Leafs add Tanev trade. So I want to see what exactly would the Leafs have to give up to get Tanev? What are people thinking here? So this trade, there's one trade that this person believes would happen before a Tanev trade happens. You trade Nick Robertson to the Washington Capitals to get a 2nd and a 4th. Obviously, we've seen the Leafs do this before, where they traded Rasmus Sandin. Now they got Gustafsson back in return, but they did get a 1st round pick. Recoup some draft capital for a younger player. That, look, Nick Robertson has done some really good things for the Leafs this year. After sitting out for a long time, he's starting to pick things up the last few weeks. The question now is, do you think Nick Robertson is a guy you want to keep around for the long term, especially in the playoffs, or do you see if maybe a team is willing to give you something that gets you something that you want? And in this case, this person believes that you take some of that draft capital you get in a Nick Robertson deal, and you go and get yourself Chris Tanev with 2.25 retained. You trade Calgary a 3rd round pick and that 2nd round pick that you get from Washington, which is technically not Washington's pick, but the Bruins pick in 2025. And then you're also doing a 1-for-1 trade with the Islanders, Oliver Wahlstrom for Connor Timmins. Not sure I really see a deal like that coming together, but a lot of people are seeing a Connor Timmins being traded out of town. I wouldn't be surprised if the Leafs need to get salary moved, kind of like when they traded Pierre Engvall, just to get his salary off the books. I think you could really do see the Leafs doing a trade like sending Connor Timmins, considering what he makes, and him not being a regular in the lineup. That's just a little too much for the Leafs to carry right now. I could see that. I can understand that. So after the picks are done, the interesting thing here is the Leafs don't even use a 1st round pick in this. I think that's what that person was trying to get at here. And obviously the change here is Wahlstrom would take over for Nick Robertson. I just don't know if I see Lou Lamoriello parting with Oliver Wahlstrom for Connor Timmins. That's why I'm not really sure about that one. Then you get Chris Tanev, obviously, at $2.25 million cap hit. So again, not the most bizarre, I will say, not the most bizarre moves considering. I mean, the first one was a bizarre one. That one was just me trying to gauge how people will come up with something like that. But the other two weren't terrible. And the reason why I say that is because, again, I do think Chris Tam is going to fetch more because I think more teams are going to be involved. More teams are going to be interested and the price is going to go up. But the Adam Larson one was an interesting one because, again, that's the ideal type of target. If you're going to go and make a move for the Leafs, try to get someone with term. Adam Larson is that guy, and he's a top 4 guy. He does bring some of those elements that I think you're going to need and come playoff time. Adam Larson does bring a little bit of that. What say you, Leafs fans? Any of those trades make sense for you? Does even making a trade make sense for you? Let me know. And we are going to be doing the mailbag this week. I'm asking you guys submit your mailbag requests. I'm going to put out a separate video as well so that you get those mailbag requests, and I will hopefully have that. I'm trying to get the little end of the week, give some people some time to ask questions, but I do want to do that mailbag. It might even have to be a 2-part episode because we tend to get quite a few mailbags, and I like to go and be pretty thorough with the responses to the mailbag. So we'll do that here later on the Locked On Leafs podcast. Want to thank you all for listening and supporting the show. You can go and follow myself at @the_Morassutti on X. You can also follow the show at Locked On Leafs. Make sure you go and subscribe. Tell all your friends. Make sure you also catch us up on YouTube. Make sure you're getting notifications of when the new videos come out. We really do appreciate it. Comment, give us a like, give us a good rating over on iTunes as well, so that helps with the algorithm a little bit. But until then, keep locked right here on Locked On Leafs.